Hello, everybody. Good morning. May I invite your attention to the words that you find on your screen now? The dead yesterday, the unborn tomorrow. Why fret about them if today be sweet? Are you familiar with these words? I'm sure you've come across these words at some point of time. They are some of the most oft quoted words, so inspiring, so motivating, so celebratory of the present. Now, what is significant is that these lines, written in a bygone time, in a language that the rest of the world is not familiar with, would not have been part of our common repertoire had it not been for the translation done by the American writer Edward Fitzgerald. It's only that translation that has enabled us to get a whiff of the Persian classic, the Rubaiyat. The same holds good for classics of any language. The works of Tagore, the works of Kalidasa, the works of Homer, Iliad, writers from any part of the world and their works become familiar to people in other times, other cultures, other regions, only because of this act of translation. That just makes us aware of the great significance that translation has in the world of literature. Well, translation adds beauty not just to literature. Translation is part of, the global transactions in every field today, in business, in trade, in commerce, in science and technology, in the computer revolution, any field you look at it, without translation, without the act of translation, global communication would really not be fully possible. It's a multi-million dollar industry, this the industry of translation, and the significance of translation keeps increasing by the day, which is why it's so important that we have a module on translation. We get introduced to the rudiments of translation, to the practice of translation, and are enabled to consider it as a very uh, viable career option. Now, translation at the most basic level is the communication of ideas from one language to another, the transfer of ideas from one language to another. But it's not so simple a process as that statement indicates. Translation is a very complex activity which requires a very layered and nuanced practice. You have, the whole process consists of the translation of an idea from an original text, which can be considered as the source language, SL, to a target language, TL. No, it's not a word-to-word translation that we are talking about here. It is not a simple activity that just requires anybody who's familiar with with the source language and the target language to simply translate the words. What is important is to convey the idea, the thought, the feeling, the emotion, the tone, and therefore you just cannot brush it aside as a very simple activity. All the more reason why we need to discuss this topic and look into its scope, its challenges, its implications, and the diversity and the complexity involved in translation. And if we do not give it that kind of attention, if we do not treat it with that kind of seriousness, then what we will end up with would be uh, the kind of things or situations that I would like you to take a look at in the slides that are coming up. So let's take a look at this road sign which was put up um, somewhere in the north of India, which asks people to drive carefully because 90% of all people are caused by accidents. What was meant was that 90% of all deaths of people are caused by accidents, and therefore the people should drive carefully. So look at the way in which communication is so badly shattered in this board. Now it's just not just an Indian phenomenon. Take a look at the boards in the next slide. There is a board in China, for example, which says that execution is in progress, where what is meant is that there is work going on there and that people need to be careful, but they have used a very formal word like execution, which is what somebody would have got if that person had been searching through a thesaurus, for synonyms of work in, uh, from the Chinese word to Chinese work to English. So it becomes execution, which is nothing but chopping somebody's head off. Then here is from the lobby of a hotel in Moscow, there was this instruction given regarding the visiting hours at a monastery. You're welcome to visit the cemetery where famous Russian and Soviet composers, artists, and writers are buried daily except Thursday. What was meant was that the visitors are allowed on every day except Thursday. But look at the way the idea communicated turns out to be that you have these famous composers, artists, scientists, and writers being buried there every day. From in the Norwegian language, when something was translated into English outside a bar, it read like this: ladies are requested not to have children in the bar. The ladies are not allowed to take children into the bar, but the translation ended up with this kind of faulty message. So, this is a global phenomenon. When you are not fully familiar with the source language and you just end up doing translation in a rather automatic, in a rather haphazard manner, where your only interest is in just translating a word into another language, then you end up with these kinds of disasters. So, which is why it is very important for us to know what this whole activity of translation implies. So, translation, to define it, is the communication of meaning from one language, which is the source language or SL, to another language, the target language. And the purpose of translation is to convey the original tone and intent of a message, taking into account the cultural and regional differences between the source and the target languages. And we also need to keep in mind the fact that translation is a word that we normally use to refer to written communication, whereas the same activity often happens in the spoken medium, where that is called not translation but interpretation. Now, there are some unavoidable requirements for competent translations. In the first place, we need proficiency in both the source language and the target language. Secondly, much beyond that verbal proficiency, we also need a thorough understanding of the cultural background of both the languages, the source language and the target language. The cultural significance of words in each uh, context is a prerequisite. Without knowing the resonance, the cultural resonance of a particular word, of a particular phrase, or of a particular idiom, we would not be able to do justice to it in another language. to be able to communicate what it conveys. It's often not the literal or the verbal meaning that is communicated. The words have resonances. Words have not just denotative, but connotative meanings. Words which are beyond the literal or plain meanings, metaphorical meanings, the deeper meanings, the elusive meanings, and so on. So, and then we need a familiarity with the registers, of that particular uh, field with which the document that we are translating deals with. We need to have a thorough understanding of the topic. It could be any field, for example, it could be a medical document, it could be a poem, it could be a legal document, it could be a very technical document that you are translating. And without having a thorough understanding of the jargon of each field, that is the technical vocabulary of each field, the registers that are used in particular fields, and so on, you again would not be able to do justice to the act of translation. And overall, we need to have uh, a thorough understanding or awareness of the fact that translation is not a monolithic or a single monosided, unisided activity. It has three distinct phases or processes involved in it. In the first stage, we decode the source language. We are given a text and we need to decode it, understand it, that document, the you know the piece of writing that needs to be translated, understand it fully at the verbal level and at the deeper metaphoric level. We need to decode it. What we are presented is a coded text. It is presented as a single text, but we need to understand the different components that go into it. We need to understand all that makes up that document. So that would include the words, that would include the meaning, that would include the tone, the idea, the ideology, the thought. So much is there. So we need to tease out all these. We need to separate all these and understand the complexity of the text that we are given to translate. So that whole process of understanding and separating out the different components of the given text is what is known as decoding. And then you enter the next phase where you are dealing with both languages, the source language and the text in the source language, and you're thinking about the target language to which you are translating it. So you need to enter a phase of transcoding. So how does this word translate to another word? How can I convey this idea in another language? How can I convey this tone in the other language? So thinking of both the source language and the target language and looking at the way each decoded component of the source language, the way it should be rendered in the target language. So that process is the the crux of the matter. This is where the maximum of your input, the translator's input, should go in. So the transcoding or the transfer from the source language to the target language. And therefore you end up with a lot of components in the target language. You have the words now, you have the thoughts, you have the ideas, you have the tone, you have the suggestion. All that is now part of a rough draft that you have. And therefore, the final stage would be to modify that rough draft into a fair draft, which is the process of encoding it. All the separate entities should be brought together in such a way that you come up with a finished product in the target language, the encoded. You're now giving it another coded structure. From the coded structure of the source language, you decoded the separate components, and then you entered a phase where you were dealing with both the languages and the decoded aspects of both the languages, and then you come up with the encoding. The final stage consists of encoding it into a proper document in the target language. So, it goes without saying that the whole process of translation takes a great deal of time, attention, energy, and a great deal of commitment and involvement. So we need to comprehend, the translator must comprehend perfectly the source language, the target language, and also be as knowledgeable as possible in the subject matter. The greater the depth of the translator's knowledge in that subject, the better will be the translation. The more perfect will be the translation. And the translator needs to get into the document in such a way that the translator is able to, understand, to comprehend fully, to relate to the original writer's intention, thoughts, opinions, feelings, and uh, that whole stand taken by the original writer. Well, translation, as we discussed at the beginning of this session, is a major activity at the global level today. And it's not just the literary classics or literary works that get translated. Of course, that is a major phenomenon. The moment a major award like the Nobel Prize for Literature or the Booker Prize is announced, you can see, the very next moment you have, the very next instant you have the translations of these works from other languages appearing in the local languages in the local bookstores. So that's a major activity. But apart from that, all the sources of knowledge today are in the world of the World Wide Web. We have online resources of knowledge today, and these sources of knowledge are again translated to cater to the requirements of people across the globe. So in that whole process of computer localization, enabling people of different regions to get access to the sources of knowledge online or in the world of internet, we again depend on translation. So it is uh, translation is as old as the hills. It is something, as soon as language evolved, we can imagine how translation would have been an immediate activity. It's been done by humans for centuries now. We are familiar with the classics of the ancient world. So even when they were in the oral mode, translations had taken place, and that's why we are familiar with the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Mahabharata and all those classics. No, and today translation has evolved to such an extent that you have sophisticated software tools and all kinds of technology to accomplish the task of translation. Artificial intelligence has taken translation to a whole new level. You were familiar with the robot Sophie, who is a very sensitive robot. The artificial intelligence that has wired Sophie the robot is one such is such that it can communicate not just the words but also the feelings, the thoughts, um, and the emotions. And organizations all over the world, encompassing a multitude of sectors, missions, and mandates, rely on translation of content like the product labels, the technical documentation, user reviews, promotional materials, annual reports. So many kinds of documents are or need to be translated to various languages. So it is definitely a major industry in the field of culture and literature. Any activity that has such significance and such global import will naturally not be a very simple task. It comes with a lot of problems and challenges. In the first place, since we're dealing with two languages, two different languages, the first major problem that we would encounter in the process of translation would be the syntactic constraints, that is, the structural differences between the source language and the target language. we are familiar with the word order of English. We learned how, the simplest English grammatical structure is the SVO, subject, verb, and object structure. But that doesn't hold good for other languages. So these structural differences, the grammatical differences, the word order, the differences in the word order of each language, that is the first major problem, the syntactic constraints. And then we come to the semantic constraints, the meanings of words, the meanings of idioms, and so on. It's not enough simply to resort to a dictionary, which might give us the meaning, the literal meaning of a particular word. We need to understand the implications or the different senses in which that word might be used. So there are a lot of constraints at the level of semantics dealing with the meanings, the desired meaning. What is the true meaning that is conveyed through a particular word? It often may not be restricted to its literal meaning. And the problem becomes compounded when we deal with idiomatic structures and proverbial constructions and so on. They can never be, that an idiom like "it's raining cats and dogs," which is a common enough expression in English to talk about heavy rain, it can never be translated per se, literally into another language. We need to understand uh, the implication of that idiom and translate that idea into another language. Thirdly, we have a lot of cultural constraints and differences. The meaning of a particular word in a particular cultural context, for example, can never be the same in another language. I remember reading about the challenges faced by people, a translator who translated the works of Thackeray into Hindi and other Indian Hindi, for example. She said how it was so difficult to convey the sense of a word like Ammavan or Mund into Hindi. Mamaji or Dhoti just cannot convey the reverberations and the significance of these two words in the context of a Malayali, in the cultural context of a Malayali. Then we have the stylistic constraints. How do we communicate the tone, the style? Each writer would probably have a particular style, and then there is a particular tone that is conveyed. It could be sarcasm, it could be a protest. How do we convey sarcasm in another language? It's very, very challenging. So the stylistic constraints of conveying the similar tone and style in the target language. And finally, the technical and the professional constraints, where you might not be familiar with the terminology, the vocabulary, the jargon of a particular field, and your inability to therefore communicate it in the target language. So these are the various problems and challenges that you face when you translate a text from one language to another. These are just the basic challenges. You can think of many more, ideological challenges. The standpoint taken by a writer. How would a translator be able to do justice to it if that writer has a different standpoint altogether? A very patriarchal text, for example, and a very, feminist translator. How would a feminist translator be able to do, to translate to a very patriarchal text without uh, conveying the translator's own ideology? What you're expected to do is to translate it from the source language to the target language as the original writer had intended it. So these are major challenges. However, the challenges that we have highlighted here, the linguistic ones, the syntactic constraints, the semantic ones, the cultural differences, stylistic and other constraints, these can be addressed to a great extent by familiarity with both languages. The more you are familiar with a language, the better will you be able to communicate its nuances into another language. Um, yeah, so read good models of a source language and the target language, listen to better models of the source language and the target language. It is said that music, listening to the songs of each language can enable you to pick up that language in a very effective manner. So look for these opportunities and try to gain proficiency in languages so that you can do your bit as a translator. Now, as far as your syllabus is concerned, you will be given a passage in Malayalam, which you will have to translate into English. That is the kind of question that you can expect in a question paper. So to begin with, I'll just give you a sample. It's a poem that appeared in a recent Malayalam weekly, in the Mathrubhumi weekly last week. In fact, it's a poem written by the Malayalam poet P.N. Gopi Krishnan. I want you to read the poem and translate the first 4 stanzas. So this is the poem for you, Shalabhavam Namalu by P.N. Gopi Krishnan. Read it fully, where he distinguishes between the world of a butterfly and we, the human beings. Read it fully and get into the feel of the poem and try to translate it. Translating it into English, translating the whole poem into English would be a mighty challenge for you. So to begin with, I would like you to translate the first 4 stanzas of this poem. And then you can give yourself the joy of translating the remaining part of the poem too. So begin with the first 4 stanzas. Okay.